Welcome to the voices of transparency and excellence. We're not pivoting, the world is spinning like a top. Let's stop, figure things out, get some answers. Come with us on this ride. Warm regards, Rick and Judi.
Welcome to our podcast series where we address crucial topics impacting our campus and community. I'm Judi Brown Clarke, here with...
And I'm Rick Gatteau. And our podcast today is a study in political psychology with two PhDs and authors in the field, political scientists Leonie Huddy and Stanley Feldman. They study political behavior in individuals, institutions, and leaders.
So I'm going to start with the first question to Leonie. The country seems to be pretty closely split politically, 46 to 55% approximately. But the divide feels like there is something bigger, deeply in distrust, dislike, and so on. How did we get here, and what do we do to get back to listening to each other with civility?
Well, let me start with the first part about being divided. What we've seen in political science, and I'll add that we study public opinion, so we do a lot of surveys, we look at a lot of people's answers to questions. What we've seen over the past maybe 3 decades is that the American public is sorted. And we've heard a bit about this, but it's driving polarization. And we've sorted along different lines. So one can be religion. We've seen, for example, that evangelical Christians are heavily concentrated in the Republican Party. What that does is start to set up morality issues, which people care really deeply about, and they're hard to cross. You know, once you become divided on morality, the other side starts to look immoral, and that's a problem. We've also had sorting along racial and ethnic lines. It's not as deep as we had thought prior to this election and some before that. But nonetheless, African Americans remain very loyal Democratic voters. The Latino vote is more Democratic than Republican, but not as strongly so as the Democratic Party had believed. But again, nonetheless, what's happening there is people are concerned about issues affecting their group. They're worried about, am I getting a fair shake? Is my group being respected in American society? And we see whites in both parties, so we can't say that whites are one way or another, but there is a sense that there is some racial, ethnic tensions. We're seeing issues like immigration come to the fore. So this has been developing. I mean, it's been an incredible change, and the parties also have become more ideological on social issues, not economic. So what we're seeing is these issues about how groups are treated, religious, ethnic, racial, even regional. We've started to do some research in our department on Southern identity. Southerners are Republicans. And that's obviously been a major shift from way back earlier in the 20th century. But these are part of the explanations. And as that has happened, in some sense, the parties have clarified for people their stances on these social issues that are pretty easy to understand.
So one quick follow-up to that, when we think about from the sorting perspective, when we sort laundry, we have lights, darks, and in-betweens. So there's an in-between, there's a bell curve. And so with this sorting, it seems to be so binary. It's you're with us or against us. It's this. Anything that's not this feels like an opposition. How do we address that?
Well, what I would say is that we are sorted to some extent, but not completely. So we can also exaggerate the degree to which we're different. We are different along these lines. But there are a lot of people who are not all that political. So there are people in the middle who don't feel as strongly, are not as polarized. We don't hear a whole lot from them, but
Right.
They're out there. And a lot of them aren't really very interested in politics. Remember, about a third of people don't vote in this country, even though they're eligible to do so, and they're not switched on to what's happening.
Thank you.
Yeah, Stanley, can I ask the question, just to follow up to what Leonie said? I was curious about the economic and social aspects, because growing up, I always think I thought about it from an economic perspective as how people made their decisions in voting. But your point about how social issues have become more, can you talk a little bit more about that?
So that has been a really major change in how the Democratic and Republican parties compete. And you're right. throughout, certainly from, if not before the New Deal, 1930s, up to maybe 20 or 30 years ago, a major line of competition between the parties was on economic issues, with Democrats basically pushing an expansion of the welfare state, bringing in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Republicans arguing for smaller government, lower taxes. That if we were having this conversation 30 years ago and talked about how the parties differ, that would have been the starting point. So you're absolutely right. But as Leonie said, over the last 3 decades, that's really changed. And increasingly, when voters look at the Democratic and Republican parties, what they see first and foremost is this competition, conflict over social issues, about gay rights, about abortion, about transgender rights, about the role of religion in politics. There is still an economic component to it. There's no question about that. But there's been just a dramatic shift so that voters looking at the parties really see these social issues as being the primary source of conflict between the Republican and Democratic parties.
And would you say in the data today, we look at, to Judy's point about this polarized society we live in and these just distinct viewpoints, where are the moderates in this? Do we have moderates anymore, or is that group shrinking? Where do we see people along the ideological spectrum, if you will?
That has been another big aspect of partisan sorting. So again, if you look back to the even through some of the last decades of the 20th century, the parties were much more ideologically diverse, and there were middles to both parties. I'm certainly old enough to remember when there were plenty of moderate and even liberal Republicans. If you just think about New York, Nelson Rockefeller, Jacob Javits, Republicans who now would be considered to be quite liberal. There were conservative Democrats. So there was a lot more ideological diversity to the parties, more overlap, more moderates. As Leonie indicated, the sorting has also sorted on ideological grounds, and the parties are just much further apart ideologically, so that if you look at Congress, certainly while there are a lot of moderates, as Leonie pointed out, a lot of people are not polarized in terms of voters. But if you look at Congress and the elected representatives, they certainly have. There's no question that when political scientists quantify the ideological position of Democrats and Republicans in the House, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, that the middles have disappeared. The overlap has disappeared. The Democratic Party is definitely almost to a person to the left of the Republican Party to the right. The Democrats, among elected officials, there is very little middle for voters to see.
So it brings me to the question, and I take it back to K-12 education, and definitely in middle school and high school, where we learned debate. And when we had to do a paper on something, half the class did it on one, and the other class did it on the contrary. And so what you learned is empathetic listening, understanding without agreeing, and really not about recruiting, but really having clarity and positions beyond yourself. So number one, we understand where that skill is there's a deficit. So when you think about some of this ideological polarization, and you think about kind of the evolution, as you talked about, the evolution of where Republicans used to be, because Republicans 20, 30, 40 years ago look very much like Democrats now, and vice versa. So there's an evolution process, and evolution flows both ways. And so I wonder, how do we get back to the point of empathetic listening? I don't have to agree with you, but I have to absolutely be curious enough to know what we agree on, and then how can we negotiate that? We know what we don't agree on. I have to be curious and leaning into how do we start to navigate good public policy and moving forward.
So let me tackle this question.
Sure.
It's really difficult. What's happening right now, because we have a lot of loud noise and loud people on social media, those people who are more moderate, who might want to engage in this conversation, are afraid to bring up politics.
Right.
Does anyone really want to have an argument? You're not sure where it's going to go. You're not sure if the other person is going to be an empathetic co-listener in this
Yes.
conversation. And that's a problem for a lot of people. So what's happening is, I'd say the majority of people, when we ask them, would you share content on social media that's political? Many people say, no way, I'm not getting involved in that. But some people are, and those people are very loud and very adamant about their position. So that, I think, further exacerbates the problem.
Yeah.
The other difficulty is the people who are engaging in these conversations are already there.
Yeah.
They're already happy to have these conversations. They're open-minded. I hope we teach political science. My goal is to make it possible for all of our students to have those conversations. We try to have them in the classroom. We need to listen. We need to understand people have different viewpoints, and maybe if we listen. So what I was going to say is political scientists and a lot of other people are trying to figure out, how do we get out of this? Yes. It's not going to be easy. And so one of the most successful interventions, but it's very modest, is to basically have contact with someone, have a reasonable conversation with them, and learn that they don't hate you, for example.
Right.
And that's part of the problem, is that I think I'm having this conversation, you hate me. We're going to end up screaming at each other, and it's going to be very, very unpleasant. I don't want to take part in that. So the difficulty is getting the right people into that conversation. Now, what I will say, and I've done some research on this, I would like our leaders to act that way. They, in many senses, set the tone of our inter-party conversations. And there have been some experimental studies. People are exposed. You can do this by showing them leaders speaking pleasantly and in an empathetic way to each other. And it does moderate negativity towards the other political side.
Keep in mind, too, that it is much more difficult to have this conversation when the conflict is over moral issues, right? So go back to Rick's point, if we're talking about tax policy, you can compromise, right? You can adjust the tax rates, you can adjust government spending, and people can say, I got some of what I wanted, I didn't get everything, but it's enough, right? But if we're arguing about abortion, if we're arguing about gay rights, if we're arguing about religion, it's very difficult for people who are intense on those issues to find a middle place. How do you, if you're strongly pro-life, how do you compromise? If you think that homosexuality is a sin, how do you compromise? That's part of what makes this difficult. And as Leonie suggested, getting out of this is partly going to be toning down the conflict around morality. And it's, as long as we're focused on moral differences between the parties, then it's hard for people to talk to each other.
Can I ask a question just from a historical perspective? So think about our U.S. Congress. Did they always vote on party lines because nowadays, to your point about looking through a social issues lens, right? There's not as much room for compromise. Words, I think, like bipartisan or reach across the aisle, I don't hear very much anymore. And I'm wondering what's the evolution that's occurred over the last few decades related to that?
As I said, we've got a lot of research on this, and what's really changed in Congress in particular is just the ideological nature of the parties, right? When the Democratic Party was more of a big tent and had more conservatives, and when the Republican Party had more moderates and liberals, there were points of intersection. There were people who could work with each other because they weren't that ideologically that far apart. That middle in Congress has really vanished, right? There's very little overlap. And so that is part of it. And the other thing is not only have the parties separated, but the political leaders are really sending messages and in terms of this discussion, not very helpful messages that you can't compromise with the other side, right? And so that, as Leonie said, some of this is a function of what voters are hearing from their elected representatives.
Can I just add something
Sure.
here? So, and politicians will say if they do compromise, they're attacked on social media, right? So I remember many years ago hearing John Boehner, who was Speaker of the House when Obama was president, saying that he blamed it all on social media. He said he would try to sneak in through the back door in the White House to have conversations with Obama, and he would be immediately condemned on social media for selling out. Now, we see this on the left and right.
Right.
It's the same problem. So even those people who would like to maybe find common ground with the other side are fearful not only of the voters, but of other forms of retribution from their political leaders.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a very difficult situation in which to be an elected representative.
So, to both your points, that's actually it's a strategy. It's a strategy, and if it's a strategy on fear, and I can frame what you do public facing, then it's a form of control. But going a little different direction when we talk about our legislative representatives and the fact that it costs a lot to run a campaign right now. So when we think about, where are our leaders? It's like if we could only get this flow and influx of leaders that represented the voice of the moderates and more of those that would reach across the aisle and push back. But we also know that directly correlated to your success is a financial stability and who's behind you. And so can you talk a little bit about the juxtaposition of most people that are in office now are financially secure, wealthy, have backers and donors, and what the public perception is and why that may lead to a correlation of mistrust?
Possibly. I mean, my view, having met public officials, is many of them go into this for good reasons, right? And maybe they feel financially secure enough to get involved in public office. But things happen along the way. And so it's not necessarily the case that a wealthy person can't represent you. I mean, great if you have someone who really is like you and can hear you. It's not necessarily the case. So I'm not sure that we can blame that exactly. I think the party structure, where would we point to? Primaries, we have a problem with our primaries.
I'm sorry, I should have said more in the primaries, not once you get to the general.
Yeah, so
Right.
it's really how the small percentage of hardcore Democrats and Republicans who show up in primaries. At best, it's 20% of that electorate who shows up, and they're usually fairly plugged in. They're very ideological. They usually have more extreme positions than the electorate as a whole. The moderates aren't showing up to vote in primaries. That results in more extreme individuals being selected by the
Right.
party, and then once you're selected, it's like you can be the dog catcher as long as you're a Democrat or as long as you're a Republican, you're going to win office. So we have a fundamental problem with the electoral system and how the primary system is working.
Why don't moderates show up for the primaries? What's the theory on that?
Well, we have a lot of elections in the U.S., and if you look around the world, the U.S. is really an outlier in terms of how much we ask people to vote. We have local elections. We have state elections. We have congressional elections every 2 years. And associated with all of those general elections are primary elections. And so there's really a lot of pressure on people to come out and vote. And as Leonie said, even in presidential elections, a third of registered voters, eligible voters, don't vote. Then you get to off-year elections, and the percentage of non-voting goes up even higher. And then you get to primary elections, and then you're talking about the most strongly identified Democrats and Republicans who will turn out to vote in those primary elections. And that's really where you see this polarization, right? So the consequences of the polarization that we're talking about is most clearly seen in these primary elections. And that is a major factor. The other thing that goes along with that is that there are smaller and smaller number of really competitive congressional elections. There are the number of safe seats now in the House of Representatives is enormous. Democrats and Republicans in every 2 years are really competing over just a relatively small number of competitive districts. So someone who's very, very conservative wins a Republican primary in a safe Republican district, they're elected to Congress. If a very, very liberal Democrat wins a primary election in a safe Democratic seat, they're going to be elected. The moderates don't have enough influence over that process. And that's why we see so much of this ideological polarization.
And can I just add that moderates tend to be less involved in politics? This is one of the paradoxes, right? The more we're involved, the more extreme we become, the more we are convinced of our positions and our convictions. We're all subject to this, as I tell everyone. Even our best friends who are very politically engaged are also very biased in their viewpoints and regard the other side as immoral. So the truth is the moderates aren't that into it. They're moderate because they really aren't that invested in politics.
Interesting. Can you share a bit about how you see the evolution of political campaigns over the last couple of decades in terms of how do candidates garner voters and what's the process that people are following in terms of whether they talk to social psychologists to get intel in terms of how to then manage and launch their campaign? What strategies have evolved over time?
So it's a business, right? Campaign strategy is a real business, and the people who get involved in that are deeply immersed in campaigns. I'd say we often teach students who could end up there. So what I always say is that political science is giving them a foundation. They probably learn something about political behavior, political psychology, but a lot of that is highly inductive. When you get into that campaign, you're polling, it's not very deeply psychological questions. They're asking a lot about, how do you dislike the candidate, a few superficial issues, because often there isn't a whole lot of thought going into this among the voters. So advertising has been incredibly influential. Now, social media, what we saw, I think the Obama campaign was one of the first that really employed a lot of political scientists, actually, and did a lot of experiments and testing on how to get you to donate, what kind of message will resonate. And what we're seeing is highly targeted campaigning that's made much more possible by cell phones, by social media. Now I can reach small niche audiences that were in the past had to do some sort of general television ad that couldn't be quite as specific or targeted. So we're probably seeing very, very specific kinds of messages that we wouldn't have seen in the past.
So one of the things that we have noticed a trend in campaigning is the negative framing. And it seems to be very convincing. And so can you talk a little bit about the evolution of and why that's resonating so much with the general public when you get the negative framing versus talking about your platform, what you're going to do, and so on? Vilifying the candidate seems to be working.
Negative campaigning isn't anything new, right?
Mm-hmm.
For as long as there have been election campaigns, there's been negative campaigning and negative ads. So in one sense, whether or not it's completely true, campaign advisors believe that attacking your opponent can oftentimes be more effective than advertising your candidate's positions. The fact that we're seeing negative campaigning by itself isn't new. What's probably new, as Leonie suggested, that social media allows candidates and campaigns to reach smaller and smaller subgroups of voters and target messages to them, right? And when you can do that, you can really tailor negative advertising to particular groups more effectively than when you are running ads on TV that reach very broad audiences. Now you can go to Twitter. Now you can go to Facebook. Now you can go to Instagram. Now you can go to TikTok. And you can target ads because you know that a specific group of people will see them. And campaign advisors can then try to strategize on what's the most effective way to attack your opponent among that particular group of voters. So if anything has changed, that's really what's changed in campaigning.
And let me just say about emotions. So we're political psychologists and we sometimes study emotions. So what a lot of these campaigns are doing is trying to reach their own supporters and get them to turn out, right? It's not even persuasion. We used to think there's both persuasion and mobilization as the purpose of these ads. Persuasion is difficult. You've just got a few people in the middle. You've got some people there that you might try and target, but a lot of the ads are designed to get you out to vote. And there are two really powerful emotions that can do that. One is anger,
And fear.
and the other is enthusiasm. And so the truth is we see both kinds of ads. I want to make you inspired. I want to make you feel like, hey, this is going to be great. I'm going to be amazing. You've got to send that message to your supporters. You can't just make them angry at the other side.
As we wrap up, you want to share any closing thoughts?
We wish we had some evidence of strategies that can be used to try to reduce polarization. As Leonie suggested, there have been a few interventions that work to a very, very modest degree, but something really fundamental is going to have to change about our politics and about elite messaging and about competition between the parties for us to begin to see a movement back towards what partisan competition looked like even 25 or 30 years ago.
Well, I just wanted to thank you both so much, Leonie and Stanley. Your insights were just incredible today, and so appreciate your time.
And thank you so much. I'm Judi Brown Clarke, and we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to you at our next podcast. Have a great day.